Welcome to the second season of the WUDC Distinguished Lecture Series. This season revolves around effective altruism, and the episodes are organized in coordination with the Effective Altruism Debate Championship. Today, our speaker is Nick Beckstead. Nick is a program officer for the Open Philanthropy Project, which he joined in 2014. He oversees a substantial part of Open Philanthropy's research and grant-making related to global catastrophic risk reduction. Previously, he led the creation of Open Phil's grant-making program in scientific research. Prior to that, he was a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Nick did a Ph.D. in philosophy from Rutgers University, where he wrote a dissertation on the importance of shaping the distant future. Nick's talk is titled Existential Risks, Fundamentals, Overview, and Intervention Points. It will be followed by a short Q&A. I'm Dan Lahr, I'll host the talk. Notes will be in the channel, and if you like the content and would like to see similar one, please subscribe. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen share going. Okay, I want to talk about existential risks today. To kick us off, I want to reflect a little bit on the situation with COVID-19 and what it has to do with existential risks. So we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. About 40 million people have been infected and over 1 million people have died so far. And the world was generally underprepared for the pandemic. I think it's interesting to ask whether that was a foreseeable failure. And I think it was. We had an existence proof in the 1918 flu pandemic and the Black Death that this kind of event was possible and could have dramatic consequences for the world. And the prevailing view among pandemic preparedness experts that I've listened to has been that it was just a matter of time until the next one. So why weren't we more prepared for it? From a certain point of view, it's unsurprising. It would be tough for markets to anticipate this problem and prepare for it. Our normal models for drug and vaccine development require an established target, very expensive testing to get authorized treatment, and doing the fundamental R&D that's necessary to improve our ability to rapidly immunize the population against unforeseen pathogens would take place over longer timescales and be tough to monetize on standard models. Basically, it's a public goods problem. Governments tend to respond to shorter term incentives and deal better with problems that already exist than problems that may exist in the future. Pandemic preparedness has been an underrated priority for government technocrats, and there certainly wasn't a great deal of pressure from politicians and voters to change that. So to the extent and even to the extent that a single government could prepare for this effectively, they'd be unable to internalize the full benefit of the global public good of greater pandemic preparedness. So COVID-19 is not an existential threat to humanity, but I do think it illustrates something about a way in which infrequent events with potentially catastrophic consequences are often neglected by markets and governments, even when they are extremely important. And I think that's a lesson I think it's useful for us to keep in mind as we go into this talk. Many risks follow power law distributions or approximately power law distributions, such as earthquakes, asteroids, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, terrorist attacks, forest fires, wars, and disease outbreaks. For our purposes, what's important about these power law distributions is that the worst plausible cases will often be responsible for much of the expected harm. So one can ask, is the world prepared for the worst plausible risks of any kind? What are those risks? We know from the history of nuclear weapons that the worst possible risks can be very bad indeed. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came quite close to a global nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy later said that the odds of war with Russia during that time seemed to him somewhere between 1 out of 3 and even. Reading through the history, one has a sense that these events and many others could plausibly have gone quite differently, and humanity would be lucky to live through many centuries of that type without a nuclear war. I think what that reflection on nuclear weapons suggests is that we're, for the first time in human history, living in an age where humanity might destroy itself. And I think we have reasons from the other considerations just already listed that the world might not adequately prepare for risks of that type. And so that's the basic motivation for the talk. It seems important to think about what these risks are, how likely they are, and what we can do about them. I'll do a couple of quick definitions and then give a little bit of an outline of where we want to go. An existential risk is a risk that threatens the destruction or drastic curtailment of humanity's future potential. And an existential catastrophe is an event that results in the destruction of that potential. So we're thinking about the really absolute worst cases here, things like an asteroid hitting the Earth and killing everyone, or something that's so bad that it's going to make things terrible and it's never going to go away, such as a permanent global tyranny or something like that. We're not talking about events that are kind of close to the worst events in human history so far. Things like World War II or the Black Death, though they're extremely bad, obviously, that's not what I mean by an existential risk. So the goals for this talk are to explain why existential risks are an important thing to focus on. There's some philosophical considerations underlying that, and what types of existential risks we should put most of our attention on. I want to talk a little bit about what the range of existential risks are, and also describe some of the intervention points for reducing these risks. I'd like to start with a thought experiment from Derek Parfit, who's widely seen as one of the great moral philosophers of the 20th century. At the end of his magnum opus, Reasons and Persons, he gives these three cases. He asks the reader to imagine, first, peace; second, a nuclear war that kills 99% of the world's population; and third, a nuclear war that kills 100% of the world's population. Parfit says, 2 would be worse than 1, and 3 would be worse than 2. Which is the greater of these two differences? Most people believe that the greater difference is between 1 and 2. I believe that the difference between 2 and 3 is very much greater. The Earth will remain habitable for at least another billion years. Civilization began only a few thousand years ago. If we do not destroy mankind, these few thousand years may only be a tiny fraction of the whole of civilized human history. The difference between 2 and 3 may thus be the difference between this tiny fraction and all of the rest of this history. If we compare this possible history to a day, what has happened so far is only a fraction of a second. I like Parfit's quote because I think it invites us to recognize the long past behind us, and it invites us to think about the future as something real that could be vast and deep in ways that we don't normally consider. I want to just take a moment to have a zoomed out perspective on history and where we are right now, because I think it helps us to think clearly about existential risks and the future of humanity. So 500 million years ago, life emerged in the Cambrian explosion. 200,000 years ago was the beginning of the human species. 10,000 years ago was farming. 400 years ago was the scientific revolution. 250 years ago was the industrial revolution. We have about 100 billion humans who have lived so far, and about 8 billion of them are alive today. I think when you look at this at this story, a few things jump out. One of them is that things seem to be changing faster and faster. And another one is just, this point, kind of to Parfit's point, that human history may only be beginning. It seems like there could be quite a lot ahead of us still. And a third point that I want to dwell on a little bit is that it seems like we're relatively unlikely to be destroyed by nature in any given century. If we've been around this long, the odds in any given century can't be that high. And so I think where I want to go with this is, it seems in contrast that we don't have any such strong guarantees that we won't destroy ourselves in any given century. So just digging into this point a little bit more about nature being unlikely to destroy us in any given century. Humans have already been around for 2,000 centuries. So if the risk of a natural existential catastrophe in any given century were greater than 1 in 500, the odds of surviving that long would be quite small, about 2%, if you just do the math on it. So you can get a kind of quick argument that that natural existential risks are relatively small. You can get a nicer version of that argument if you think about our nearest hominid ancestors who lived about 6 million years ago. That's 60,000 centuries. If the risk of an existential catastrophe from nature in any given century were greater than 1 in 20,000, then the odds of surviving that long would also be very surprising, about 5%. So I think we can get a kind of nice argument right out of the gate that risks from nature are going to be kind of small. And indeed, if you compare that with the best available estimates of the main risks from nature that we're aware of, you get results that are roughly consistent with that. So these are numbers from Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, which recently came out, and which I think is probably the best book on the subject of existential risks. As we see, as we're going to dig into this talk later, a lot of the man-made existential risks from climate change, nuclear weapons, engineered pandemics, and AI look a lot larger than this. But we'll get into that in a moment. For now, I want to talk a little bit about a somewhat different topic, which is what is ahead of us if we avoid existential risks? How long is the potential future that's in front of us? So I think we could walk through some possibilities. One rough guess you could make is that we'll survive about as long as we've survived so far, which would be about 200,000 years, or about as long as kind of some of our nearest hominid ancestors, which went extinct about 1 million years ago. That could be a rough guess. Another kind of guess, I think on the other hand, you could think humans seem to be an exceptional species in many ways. We've taken over the biosphere really in a way that no other species ever has. We're spread out, we might be more robust. And so another guess that might be on the higher end, you could guess that humans or our descendants will be around as long as the Earth is habitable. That would be several 100 million years. But even that's really not a very clear-cut endpoint. One could imagine that our descendants leave Earth and colonize other stars. And in that kind of scenario, the caps would be a lot larger, measured in, by long-term astronomical processes, which would be in the billions or trillions of years. So those are some very long time scales, and I don't want to get too hung up on the numbers, but I do think it's a little bit important to think about just the vast number of future lives that are potentially involved in these kinds of calculations. So, if humanity survived for 200,000 years at something like current population levels, the result would be about 20 trillion future people. If it was about 100 million years, it'd be about 10 to the 16 people. If you take those numbers seriously, then even very small reductions in existential risk would have really dramatic consequences in terms of the number of future lives that are affected. So 1 in a million reduction in an existential risk would affect 20 million expected future lives in the former scenario, and more than 10 billion expected future lives in the latter scenario. So more people would be affected by that, 1 in a million reduction in an expected level than the whole population of the Earth, which is a pretty interesting thing to think about. You could have larger numbers than this in scenarios where human civilization is not limited to Earth, but these numbers are sufficiently large to motivate the point. So I won't get into that further. Now I want to talk a little bit about the scientific and industrial period that we're in and the connection that has with existential risk. So here we've got a graph of human history with a bunch of major events interspersed on it, starting from about 3,000 years ago to the present. As you can see, there's a bunch of trend lines with good things like life expectancy, GDP per capita, the percentage of people not living in extreme poverty, the amount of energy we're using, and so on. And as you can see, these things are basically flat for most of the last 3,000 years, and then essentially all simultaneously explode around 1750. It's a very interesting chart to look at. And you can see these things on the graph that kind of don't obviously affect a bunch of these variables in a huge way, despite being some of the most important events in human history. And I think the conclusion that you have to draw when you stare at this graph for a little while is that the world is changing a lot right now, and things are getting a lot better in a lot of ways, but really it's just a period of unprecedented and dramatic change. So let's think a little bit about what that means for existential risks. So I've argued that risks from nature are relatively small as existential risks. We don't have such guarantees about technological existential risks. However, the existential risks that we're aware of, the ones that people talk about and worry about, most of those seem to be coming from this process of scientific and technological development. So certainly we wouldn't be having nuclear weapons without the scientific revolution. And likewise for climate change, and likewise for some of the other risks that we're going to be talking about. So I think what that means is that, although the scientific and industrial revolutions are obviously have dramatically improved our lives in some extremely important ways, they're also fueling some of these existential risks. They've produced all of our largest candidate existential risks to date. So I think what that means is we should expect that in some kind of zoomed out historical perspective, we're living both in a time of exceptional progress and also a time when existential risks are especially likely to emerge. And I think if we thought about what future people would want, and there's this kind of vast number of future people, I think if you imagine, say, that they had the ability to vote about what we could do, about what we would do today, I think one of their main asks would be that we would heavily prioritize thinking about existential risk and how to reduce it. It seems like this would be one of the things that would matter the most to them. And if they wanted anyone in the history of the planet to be dealing with it, it seems like of all the people that have been alive so far, we would be the top people that they would hope would listen. So it seems important to ask, what mechanisms are there for addressing the interests of future generations? And I think our system is kind of, insofar as our system effectively addresses the interests of future generations, it's a bit of an accident. Markets aren't going to do it on purpose because future people can't buy and sell. Governments aren't going to do it on purpose because future people can't vote or speak. And of course, voters don't have terribly sophisticated views about all of the existential risks that are available. So, it's not a hot button issue for them. So there's no particular reason to expect governments to handle these things well by default. Perhaps, some of the general historical forces that are driving the improvements that we're talking about, they're improving many things. Maybe they'll improve our ability to handle existential risks as well. However, I think this is a bit of a speculative argument, and in many ways, we don't have a wonderful track record to look at to test it. So, we've talked about the COVID-19 example, where our preparation and response has been far from ideal. And I think if you look at the history of nuclear weapons, it looks like there's a great deal of proliferation, a great deal of near misses, a great deal of kind of accidents that were not handled the best. And likewise, I think if you look at climate change, I think it doesn't inspire a great deal of confidence that these risks will automatically be handled in an effective way. Okay, so I've kind of made sort of the rough high-level philosophical points that I wanted to make about existential risks. The key points are that existential risks from nature look relatively small, but we don't have similar guarantees from existential risks from technology. And it looks like we're in a special period of human history that has producing a great deal of progress and seems especially likely to produce existential risks if there are any to produce at all. And there's no particularly strong reason to expect these risks to be handled well by existing institutions. So I think there's a distinctive case, a distinctive moral case for placing additional weight on existential risks for the sake of future generations.
So can I ask a question there?
Yeah, sure.
So it seems likely that any sort of technological existential risk will be in a form of a military capability, like nuclear power obviously being the most cogent example. So isn't it reasonable to expect that some sort of MAD policy will be enacted again, and like I'm pointing to MAD as actually a government policy that did help mitigate some of these existential threats. I mean, arguably. Could you like relate to that?
Yeah, sure. Just thinking a little bit about that. I think I might want to take this in the end, because in the next section, I'm going to explain, in the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the range of existential risks that I'm most concerned about. And I think it'd be easier to answer that question after I'd sort of laid some of that groundwork. So why don't we save it till the end, actually?
Yeah, all right, no problem.
Yeah. Okay, so I've now kind of given the high level background about why I think existential risks are important and deserve a kind of special focus, and roughly what kind of existential risks we should expect to be the biggest deals. Now I want to talk about what actually are the threats that I think we should take the most seriously. Again, I'm going to lean on the book, The Precipice by Toby Ord. It has a nice table that lists the estimates of the sizes of the different existential risks. We have these existential risks from nature here that we've already discussed, so I'm not going to get into those more. Here's the kind of table of existential risks that are technological in nature. Naturally arising pandemics is included in the list, not because natural pandemics are technological, but because the world has arguably changed in ways that would make us more susceptible to a truly global pandemic than we would have been, say, a few thousand years ago. Obviously, a bunch of these risks are going to be more speculative, and the numbers are going to be, in some sense, crappier than the numbers that we could be using for risks from nature. So we don't have a record of millions of years of supervolcanic eruptions to build base rates off of. So these are going to be not historical frequencies that are objective, but kind of best guesses or someone's reasonable betting odds that they'd place after reading about the subject in general. I think the kind of most important points from this chart are that he puts the risk of the existential risk from nuclear war in the century at about 1 in 1,000, at about 1 in 1,000 for climate change, and actually puts the risk of existential risk from engineered pandemics at about 30 times larger than that, 1 in 30, and the risk from unaligned artificial intelligence at about 100 times larger than that, 1 in 10. So that's a pretty important claim, and I think we should dig into it. Some other interesting claims on here that the overall technological existential risk is about 1 in 6 in the coming century, and that the risks from other things that aren't included in the list are about 2%. So I'm not going to lean on all of these numbers, and I'm not going to try to explain all of them, but I do want to talk about the nuclear war, climate change, artificial intelligence, and engineered pandemics numbers. Obviously, climate change and nuclear war are seen by many, including me, as some of the most important issues of our time, and a lot fewer people are concerned about misaligned AI and engineered pandemics. So this could seem like a kind of contrarian list, and in a way it definitely is. I think part of that difference is driven by some misconceptions about nuclear war and climate change. So I want to talk about those a little bit. And then I want to talk about the positive case for thinking that existential risks from AI and engineered pandemics could be quite large. Okay, so very quickly, one often hears statements like, we have enough nuclear bombs to kill everyone 2.6 times. However, statements like these are actually misleading because they extrapolate from the maximum number of people who could be killed by one bomb in a densely populated area. In fact, it's not possible to direct all these bombs non-redundantly to densely populated areas. And more realistic estimates from war planners suggested that a nuclear war would kill around half of the US and Russian populations in 30 days following the exchange. This is from the US Office of Technology Assessment in 1979. And it was kind of playing out a scenario of a full-scale nuclear war between the US and Russia. Today we have about, we've decreased our nuclear weapon stockpiles pretty substantially since that time, and so you would actually expect probably overall a smaller effect. Nuclear war would probably cause nuclear winter, but there's no good argument that that would actually result in human extinction, and some reasons to think otherwise. So researchers who did early research on nuclear winter, like Carl Sagan, believed that nuclear winter could lead to our extinction. But people who study the issue today have explicitly argued that that's not very likely. One argument that's particularly plausible and easy to understand here is that the mechanism of nuclear winter is extremely similar to supervolcanic eruptions. And those supervolcanic eruptions have occurred many, many times over the tens of millions of years that our hominid ancestors were alive, but those did not cause their extinction in any case. So it seems very unlikely, actually, that even if we did have a nuclear winter, that it would result in human extinction. In the case of climate change, one encounters many people who believe that business as usual carbon emissions will make the extinction of humanity inevitable. For example, a colleague of mine polled students in a course they were teaching and found that about a quarter of them believed something like that. I think that's a misleading picture, and I could try to briefly state something that seems like closer to mainstream scientific opinion. The most trusted projections, like the IPCC, don't predict extinction. However, the topic has not received a great deal of attention in the scientific literature, and there are some good arguments that the IPCC underweights some of the worst case scenarios. There are some proposed mechanisms that could conceivably result in human extinction, but they're not widely accepted, and some of them seem difficult to reconcile with paleoclimate data. So I think overall, it'd be more accurate to say that I think you'll have a hard time finding prominent scientists in the field who will say things like, the science says we're headed for human extinction by default. There's a nice discussion of this in Toby Ord's book, chapter 4, and I'd recommend looking at that if you are interested in more detail on that topic. Okay, so that's a little bit about those misconceptions and why I think it is possible to put those risks at something more like 1 in 1,000 instead of kind of default ways that humanity is destroyed. I want to say a little bit about how we've ended up in this position with these kind of speculative future risks getting most of the probability in this analysis. I think it makes more sense if you kind of think about the groundwork that we've laid so far. We have a kind of good argument that risks from nature are on the small side. When we ask what could destroy humanity today, that's kind of already going on, I think nuclear weapons and climate change are the natural place to be looking. But those don't seem actually terribly likely to permanently or drastically curtail humanity's future potential. But if you ask, so we have this argument that if there is going to be something, it's probably going to be a technological capability that hasn't been developed yet. So you can ask, what would that be? I think when you start doing that, AI and advances in AI and bioengineering stand out as kind of particularly powerful forces. With AI in particular, there's a kind of plausible outline of a failure mode, and not a lot of reasons to think it couldn't happen. So that's kind of, I think, the outline of how we're getting there. And I think, obviously, it's important to caveat that these risks may look smaller or larger as we get closer. And it's possible that they'll be small. So we're just kind of working with our best guesses from the available information. Okay, but in more detail, I think if you want to read about AI risk, some of the things that I recommend looking at are Human Compatible by Stuart Russell, Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, and an essay, What Failure Looks Like by Paul Cristiano. Those are the sources I would go to for a more in-depth answer. I'm going to try to give you a kind of whirlwind answer here. I think the place to start with AI is to ask, what do the experts think? Katja Grace and colleagues published a survey in 2018. They surveyed researchers at NeurIPS and ICML, which are two of the leading conferences in machine learning. And they asked people who had published in those conferences to answer a range of forecasting questions about their beliefs about the future of AI. So the definition that they used that's going to be of most interest to me is they asked researchers about something they called high-level machine intelligence, HLMI, and they defined it as being achieved when unaided machines can accomplish every task better and more cheaply than human workers. So a kind of obviously a very impressive milestone, the kind of holy grail of AI research. They asked these researchers what they thought about when that could occur. Here's a graph of their, in gray, you kind of have a lot, you have like a representation of different answers to this question. And in red, you have their medians. So these are the points where the kind of middle of the road researcher, when they thought it was likely that HLMI would be developed. So, I don't know, just to give you a flavor, at about the 50-year mark, the survey took place in 2016. At the 50-year mark, they were about 50-50 about HLMI being developed. At the 25-year mark, they're about 30%. So really double-digit percentages, more likely than not this century, was kind of the sort of the median researcher's opinion. There was obviously a huge spread here, with some people thinking this is, very unlikely to happen anytime in the century, and some people thinking having even more aggressive views than this. Next question about what the researchers thought. I want to just read a quote from the paper. They were asked about how likely positive versus catastrophic outcomes were. Respondents were asked whether high-level machine intelligence would have a positive or negative impact on humanity over the long run. They assigned probabilities to outcomes on a 5-point scale. The median probability was 25% for a good outcome and 20% for an extremely good outcome. By contrast, the probability was 10% for a bad outcome and 5% for an outcome described as extremely bad, e.g. human extinction. So obviously that's informal polling, and it's not a scientific consensus. This is not what these researchers wake up every morning and study, and they didn't all get together and say, we have a message to the world. AGI may come this century, and it might have an extremely bad outcome for humanity. But I do think it's fair to look at this and say, this is not something that leading researchers think is a silly thing to worry about. And it seems like their implicit beliefs are that some of the things that I'm talking about are actually fairly plausible. So how could this type of failure occur? Let's talk about that a little bit. So I think if you think back to some of the history that we gave in the first part of the talk, there's this remarkable story of some apes on the savannah, essentially taking over the world through their intelligence and their ability to reason, to transfer knowledge between each other, and to develop technology on a timescale that's much faster than evolution by natural selection. Next, there's a story of some of those apes developing science and industry and becoming and having civilizations that are a lot more powerful than other ones. And so it seems like intelligence has been really a dramatic source of power in this story. And I think a kind of default prediction would be that high-level machine intelligence, if we ever developed it, would be a supercharger for capabilities like this. And I think your default prediction needs to be that it would have dramatic consequences. I want to talk about three types of existential catastrophe scenarios that I think are plausible and could emerge from this. So the first of these is going to be a scenario in which the state monopolizes control of high-level machine intelligence and institutes a kind of stable authoritarianism. I'll try to sketch a story like that. The second of these is going to be a story where not where a high-level machine intelligence is developed quite soon, but where there's a kind of kink in the progress curve where that leads from machine intelligence that's kind of not that powerful compared to humans to kind that is more powerful than humans relatively quickly. And that leads to a concentration of power. And then we'll have kind of two scenarios of failure there. And then I'm going to tell a third story that's a kind of slow takeoff. It's going to be a story of kind of entrenched dependence and dysfunction that kind of reminds me of like climate change a bit more. There's not all of this is very speculative, and there's not consensus even among the people who are terribly worried about these types of existential risks about how all this should go. So I thought it was important to give you a bit of a range. All right, so if you think about an authoritarian regime, what would you expect to end an authoritarian regime? What tends to end it in human history? I think it's things like the death of the leader, failure to control the military, failure to control the state apparatus, failure to detect and counter rebellion, failure to process information effectively. You could think of things like the socialist calculation debate. It seems like high-level machine intelligence could really change each of these factors in a quite significant way and make certain types of regime stability a lot more plausible than what we see today. And so while that's not a kind of extinction of humanity scenario, there's a kind of plausible lock-in scenario of suboptimal leadership, lack of freedom, and so on that would constitute a drastic curtailment of human potential and therefore count as an existential risk as I've defined it. It also seems like mutually assured destruction relationships could mean that other countries would not be in a position to stop it if one country did end up in this type of state. So that's a bit of a story of how this could be stable. I have less to say about how it could come about, but I'll say something. But I think I need less of a story there. States are powerful. They often like to maintain control, and they might have a legitimate interest in having exclusive control over the most powerful and dangerous aspects of AI development. So it seems like they could find a way to use that to monopolize control of high-level machine intelligence. So that's going to be scenario one. By the way, I forgot to say, all of these have a bit of a structure of there's a certain kind of stable state that's suboptimal that you end up in. And then there's going to be, so you need to tell a story of why it's stable or irreversible. And then you also need to tell a story of how you get there. So both of those elements are going to be important in each of these cases. Before I dig into these other two scenarios more, I want to talk a little bit about what's been called the AI alignment problem. That last scenario that I presented assumes that humans maintain meaningful control over increasingly advanced AI systems that they've developed. This isn't automatic, and it will require that we somehow solve what's become known as the AI alignment problem, which is, roughly speaking, the problem of designing very powerful AI systems that faithfully pursue human intentions and don't optimize against them. That problem is actually harder than it sounds, and it's certainly an open problem today. So I think, insofar as one thinks it's unlikely that this would be an existential threat to humanity, that is not going to be a view that this problem is already solved. It's going to be a view that this problem will be solved as a matter of course. But I want to say a little bit about aspects of this problem and why it doesn't seem easy. One of them is kind of weak interpretability. Most machine learning systems today can be understood at a high level or a mechanistic level that's very low level, but they often seem kind of like a black box at a mid level. So, if you think about a neural network, they often have millions of parameters interacting in complex ways, sometimes hundreds of billions of parameters in the largest models, and models are getting larger over time. if you ask a question like, how exactly did that image classifier decide that it was looking at a golden retriever instead of a Labrador retriever? You may not get an answer that's very meaningful to a human, or it might take substantial work to figure it out on a meaningful level. So this is part of what I mean when I talk about weak interpretability. So if you imagine some future system that's doing something subtly wrong internally, but it kind of looks like a giant neural network, it might be behaving well on your test set, but if there was something subtly wrong going on internally that would make it misgeneralize in a bad way, that could be quite difficult to notice just by looking at what the machine is doing. Second point has to do with easy to measure goals versus hard to measure goals. Currently, it's easy to train AI systems to optimize easy to measure goals and hard to train them to optimize hard to measure goals. So, some examples to just give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. If you're training a system to say, if you're in training input where something like reducing reported crimes, it's going to be like an easily measured thing that you can know about. And if you want to talk about actually preventing crime, not just gaming the stats, this is going to be a harder thing to specify. Similarly, predicting the next word in a sentence will be objective. Having an informative word be the next word in a sentence is going to be harder to formally specify. I think this plays in with generalization in an interesting way. So AI systems generalize pretty badly out of distribution right now. They're a bit brittle in this way. And it seems likely that generalization is going to be worse if you're training on signals that are subtly off. So, an example of like generalization failure is, if you train a face recognition system on a population that's mostly white people, and then you ask it to do face recognition on Black people, it's going to do a worse job than it will on white people. Similarly, I think an AI system that learns to carry out human feedback faithfully in one setting might fail to do it faithfully in another setting, and it's going to be worse if the kind of data that you've trained it on is crappier. Finally, I think an important piece of the AI alignment problem that is it's less important today, but will become more important in the future is the problem of giving meaningful oversight as AI systems take increasingly complex actions in the world. I think, some of the other things that we've just talked about, like the weak interpretability problem, will feed into this, but just more generally, when you take more complex actions in the world, it might become harder and harder for human overseers to actually say which things were preferred and which things were not. Okay, so that's the AI alignment problem. What if we don't solve the AI alignment problem? How bad is it? So I want to give you some intuition that it would be quite bad if you imagine a world where we have high-level machine intelligence as a world where everything can be done better and more cheaply by machines. And so there's going to be incredible economic incentives to do everything better and more cheaply with machines. So if those machines are, but you can imagine that there's a kind of separate axis, which is like sort of how well can we get these machines to follow our goals? You can imagine settings where they can do it kind of approximately or quite closely or not that closely. And I think they have different consequences that are worth thinking about. In general, weak optimization towards an almost right goal is helpful. But as the optimization becomes very strong, it can become counterproductive. So, I think like a kind of intuitive example of that is if you have a corporation that is, if you have a corporation that's maximizing profit, success can look like beneficial new drugs and medical treatment. If the corporation is, if they're weakly maximizing profit in a good setting, it can look like that. If they're strongly maximizing profit in a bad setting, it can look like fossil fuel emissions, political disinformation about climate change, and corporate lobbying. So if you're going to apply really powerful optimization pressure, you need to get the goal really right. And that's going to be some of the key points about AI alignment that I wanted to convey. Okay, so now we can make some sense of the two scenarios that I outlined earlier, being the fast takeoff concentration of power scenario and the kind of slow takeoff scenario. In the fast takeoff scenario, maybe I should say a little bit about these terms. So I think many people expect progress towards AGI or towards high-level machine intelligence to look like gradual automation of simpler jobs to more complex jobs, or simpler tasks to more complex tasks over a series of years or decades. So for example, maybe we start automating driving jobs in the near future, and then we automate some kind of simple copy editing and accounting jobs, transcription, that sort of thing. And then eventually we're doing more complex knowledge work. I think there's a more zoomed out perspective that you can take, and you might instead expect that humans are in some sense not that different from each other intellectually. We're all running on the same hardware. We all have the same evolutionary history. And similarly, one might expect that some of our hominid ancestors are also not that different from us in this sense. If AI development is going to get truly general reasoning and planning and acting abilities, one might expect that all of those abilities that we're talking about are kind of not far from each other in some absolute sense. If so, you might expect this transition from general weaker than human reasoners to general stronger than human reasoners could happen, relatively quickly from one stage to the other. Or so this is a kind of argument that I'm taking as inspired from Nick Bostrom and Eliezer Yudkowsky. There's another kind of argument you might have a fast take of, also coming from those people, that sort of goes in a somewhat different way. One of the tasks that you might eventually automate is the task of AI research, or the inputs to AI research, such as hardware R&D. And if those things themselves get automated, it could result in a scenario where there's a kind of like a fast explosion of improvements that take place. So if something like that were to happen, it seems like there would be a kind of interesting opportunity for concentration of power. So if humans maintain meaningful control over this, they've solved the alignment problem well enough to do that, there could be concentration of power in some humans, in which case you could worry about something like the stable authoritarianism scenario that I described. Or if the AI alignment problem is not solved, one could worry about a scenario in which power is concentrated in the AI systems themselves, and they're pursuing goals that are not strongly aligned with human interests, and we could get a very suboptimal outcome from that. So that's the second kind of AI scenario. And the third AI scenario that I want to talk about is what I'm kind of stylistically calling entrenched dependence and dysfunction. This is kind of my read of Paul Christiano's What Failure Looks Like that I talked about earlier. So in this scenario, everything happens more slowly. And so one sort of says, okay, there was that evolutionary history of a kind of fast improvement from chimps to humans that unlocked kind of all these general capabilities at once. But I don't think that's going to be the way that it works with machine learning. Machine learning progress in most areas has been more gradual, and there's kind of like stable curves that relate the amount of training data that we put in, the number of models, the number of parameters in the models that we're training, and model performance. And we don't see this kind of like explosive growth. Most things don't have this kind of discontinuity in their progress curve. So maybe AI won't be like that either. So I think the way to, I'm going to try to tell a version of the story that makes sense to me. You can imagine a story where we're slowly rolling out AI systems that have a broader and broader range of capabilities. They're doing tasks that humans normally do, some tasks that humans never did before. And human operators and regulators are providing feedback and oversight to ensure that the AI systems serve the intentions of owners, obey the law, and avoid imposing externalities on others. There are failures, and it's a known issue that they fail in these ways, but there's tremendous upside to getting it right. And so people do prioritize trying to get these things right. However, you can imagine that over time, as more and more of the economy is sort of automated in this way, it could become increasingly difficult to provide meaningful human oversight, and systems could increasingly optimize for basically imperfect generalizations of proxy goals that we can easily measure, instead of the things that we most reflectively want as people. So if the alignment problem is solved in a very strong way, then this could go quite well, because they would be these machines would be faithfully carrying out human intentions. If it's not, then the actions of these systems could become increasingly decoupled from human intentions, and we could end up in a pretty suboptimal state. There's also some interesting things to think about, and this is a more underexplored space in the topic of kind of emergent unintended optimization that could occur by having a very complex system with lots of agents operating at higher speeds and with less regulatory oversight per action than we're used to today. It seems like that could just more generally have other types of emergent consequences and is underexplored. But anyway, so the seriously optimal state that I'm hypothesizing we end up in here, the seriously suboptimal state that I'm hypothesizing we end up in here is one where most work is done by AI systems that are kind of imperfectly aligned with humans. And that could be a kind of opportunity cost failure. Like maybe we lose like 50% of the possible upside because it's just not quite aligned, or it could eventually get quite worse, or it could be smaller. There's not a clear quantitative answer of how bad it could be. But why would it be irreversible? So you might think, if that happens and it's suboptimal, why couldn't we just kind of walk it back while it's happening? I think it's helpful to think about climate change when you ask this question, and think about how other kinds of dysfunction in society gets locked in and gets hard to roll back. So yes, you could always say, well, it was fine in 2020. We can go back and try again with that kind of technology, but that really might not be very politically realistic. That might feel a lot like saying, why don't we just stop using fossil fuels? When something gets entrenched, when it's fueling a lot of economic growth, when there's a concentrated interest that is supporting what's going on and profiting from it a great deal, it might not be easy to roll back. Another kind of example that I think is like useful as an intuition pump is sometimes a dysfunctional system could be one where almost everyone wants it to change, but it's hard to change internally. So, you could imagine, maybe you think the United States is a little bit like this today, or maybe you think it might become like this in the future, but you can imagine, say, a society that's so polarized that it can't pass meaningful legislation, but also it's too polarized to make the types of deep reform that would be needed to solve that very problem. And it could be that everyone sort of would like that problem to be solved if they could reflect on it and coordinate appropriately, but there are things that kind of prevent them from doing that. So here it's less like, the version that I'm telling here is less like a kind of hard power story of how you get locked into the suboptimal situation, and more of just a kind of slow burn systemic dysfunction. I want to put another lens on this that I think makes it kind of interesting to think about and maybe a little bit more intuitive. In some sense, you can think of corporations as sort of like, smarter than human machines that have imperfect proxy goals. And you could think of the government as being as trying to provide meaningful oversight and correct externalities, which is basically a form of alignment failure. As that system gets faster moving, it can be harder to provide those types of corrections. So you could sort of think of the scenario I'm describing as kind of like turning those tendencies up to 11 on the knob. There's a kind of like you're adding most of the work is now being done by these machines. They might be harder to interpret than humans. Humans have to provide oversight to these machines. Things are happening more quickly. And you could think that there's sort of like the dysfunctions we see on a larger scale could be taking place. Okay, so that is me going into AI. I wanted to go into it quite a lot because it was accounting for so much of the risk in my story. And, it's such an unusual view, and it is a major emphasis for a lot of people in the effective altruism community that are interested in existential risk. I'd like to talk a little bit now about engineered pandemics as a possible existential risk. So we've talked a little bit about COVID-19 already. Obviously, COVID-19 is not an existential catastrophe. And indeed, no historical pandemic has come terribly close to being an existential catastrophe. But you could ask, what if people engineered a viral threat for maximum harm, say in a biological weapons program or something like that? Existing research has demonstrated the ability to make pathogens more transmissible, virulent, and resistant to existing vaccines. You could ask yourself, how bad could it be if somebody was to try to maximize the harm from something like this? Or perhaps more disturbingly, how bad could it be if someone does that 15 years in the future with all the advances in bioengineering that one might speculate could come during that time? I think when you do that exercise, I'm not going to do it here, but it's hard to put comforting bounds on those quantities. There's not a clear argument that, human extinction is a plausible scenario, but it does seem like there's a pretty clear argument that could be quite a lot worse than anything we've seen so far. So why would that ever happen, or why would they ever be released if they were developed? There's a long history of states attempting to develop biological weapons of mass destruction. There's a nice history of this in the book, The Dead Hand. The USSR flagrantly violated the Biological Weapons Convention and employed tens of thousands of people who were developing weapons of this kind. Outbreaks have occurred even from some highly secured labs, not necessarily biological weapons labs, but labs where research is being done on diseases. And there's some suggestive evidence that that at least one epidemic has occurred in this way. And finally, you could have a scenario where such an attack was released in retaliation. That was the original purpose of, I think, one of the main purposes behind these biological weapons, and is reflected in the name, The Dead Hand. You could also have the pathogen be stolen and intentionally released by a third party who's, has some kind of delusional beliefs about why that would be a good idea. Finally, another factor in this whole story is just the story about bioengineering progress democratizing access. So things that could be done only by, say, a professor 20 years ago could be done often by an undergrad who's participating in a synthetic biology competition today. So that bioengineering has a tendency to sort of like democratize the forefront of what can be done with current techniques. And so, even if you trust the states not to do anything too harmful with programs of this kind, there's I think there's a reasonable worry that other people, as access grows, might. Okay, so that's my quick overview of threats from engineered pandemics and how we could end up in that scenario. I think in the short run, it's mostly a government bioweapons programs worry. And in the future, there might be a different worry that has to do with too many people having access to too powerful of bioengineering techniques. I want to talk a little bit about some objections and replies to key things I've said. I might skip over some of them because I'm a little bit behind on time. But first, I want to talk about population ethics. So my argument has leaned a lot on this idea that massive numbers of future lives are at stake if we reduce existential risk by even small amounts. However, someone could object that if extinction does occur, say an asteroid hits the Earth and kills everyone, that the death count is properly thought of as the number of people who died when the asteroid hit the Earth. And it'd be unreasonable to think of it as a harm that all these future generations are never born. After all, if there's no victim, there's no problem. So this is kind of has a nice facial plausibility to it. However, I think that it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense as a thought, because there's a kind of parody of this argument that I think obviously doesn't work, and it's not clear why the argument that I just presented is better than it. Okay, so imagine that if some child is born, their life will be really short, they'll suffer terribly, and they'll die. So intuitively, if we prevented this child from being born, that would be a good thing. You could consider the following parody argument. If this child is never born, they don't benefit, and they're not a beneficiary of our action because they never exist. Only the people who live are beneficiaries. And if there's no beneficiary, there's no benefit. So you could kind of make, it's an exactly structural argument, replacing the concept of victim with beneficiary and kind of just reversing it. The argument doesn't seem any better to me. And so, unless one tells a further story about like why we should care about victims but not beneficiaries, I think this argument really doesn't, this objection doesn't go through. There's obviously a massive literature on population ethics, and I'm not gonna do justice to it in a couple of slides. I recommend reading Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit as a classic work on this subject. My dissertation is about this in the context of existential risk. And if you want opposing views, you could read David Benatar or Samuel Scheffler. But I want to say something just a little intuitive about where I'm coming from that might make some of my talk about the interests of future generations seem a bit more plausible. In general, I think if some aspect of how society is organized is having a major effect on someone's life, then that person really ought to have some kind of a say over how that aspect of society is handled. And I think the more people are affected, the larger of a say they should have. So I don't think future people should have a say over how we live all of the aspects of our lives, but if there are some things that we do that are having, particularly significant effects on very large numbers of people's lives, I think they ought to have a say. A kind of analogy would be like, imagine that, the United States was sort of polluting its rivers, and the rivers are flowing into Mexico. And then in Mexico, it's affecting the farmers and the children of the farmers in some negative way. It seems like somehow the people in Mexico ought to have a say over what is happening in the United States. And I think that this is true when, we're talking about people in a different place. And I think it's also true when we're talking about people in a different time. And I think, when we're thinking about existential risk, there's a massive number of people, and there's a relatively straightforward story about, what matters to them, the kind of planet that they inherit, the kind of life that is possible for them when they're born, whether they're born at all. These are things that dramatically affect people's lives and are kind of like preconditions for having anything that is good at all. And so it seems hard for me to believe that the right approach to ethics would not, somehow put a great deal of weight on this. I'm gonna skip this one in the interest of time. Basically, I'm gonna skip that one in the interest of time. There's an objection one might ask: why focus only on existential risks? If there are other really massive effects in the world, wouldn't those also have some effects on existential risks? Say there was an engineered pandemic that doesn't kill everyone, but it kills like 1 billion people. Couldn't that affect the distant future? And my general answer to this is that global catastrophes would need to be unprecedentedly large to have this kind of effect. But once you get into the unprecedentedly large category, then I basically agree with the argument. So I think in principle, the way I would want to think about this is like, what's the probability that this sets humanity's long-term trajectory off course in a large way, multiply through, that's the importance of it. I just think I think it's important though to talk about existential risks, because that explains how that could eventually happen. It needs to eventually terminate in an existential catastrophe. Existential risks have a particularly clear mechanism of locking in a suboptimal state. Another kind of objection you could have to what I've been saying so far is that you could just not be that into the technological speculation aspect. So, I talked a lot about AI and engineered pandemics. this is really unprecedented, crazy stuff that's talking about, you know, the world changing in dramatic ways, you might just think that that's a kind of flaky subject. And I take that worry pretty seriously. So, you know, I think it's not going to be too surprising if the world looks nothing like the stories I just told about AI in the future. However, you know, I do think these are the most plausible stories of existential catastrophe that I can come up with. And so, you know, I do take them that seriously. However, you know, I think if you don't want to go that road, I think it's worth emphasizing that you could focus on existential risk while rejecting that type of technological speculation. So you could just work on climate change. You could work on nuclear war. You could work on existential risk factors that could affect a range of existential risks, such as trying to reduce the probability of war between great powers, trying to have, you know, powerful states have more intelligent, you know, have better intelligence advice that's less likely to lead to strategic miscalculation and less likely to lead to things that are risk factors for all of the risks that I've talked about. I am going to skip this one in the interest of time. I'll do this one though. Extremism. So there's a kind of objection to this whole worldview, which you could say is that you know, it seems like if you bought it, there's some risk that it would just kind of overwhelm everything else and be a bit extremist, a bit crazy. And I think that that's an interesting and fair critique. So first, I want to observe that this is true of many plausible kind of all-encompassing philosophical positions, so that are common in effective altruism. So if you say I'm going to treat all humans equally, or you say I'm going to treat all animals equally, those worldviews can also lead to very extreme implications if you think about it. You know, perhaps those implications are right, and perhaps they're not. But I think this is not the only one that has this property. Perhaps. I think my own view is that it's probably best to live out a kind of compromise of many different perspectives, perhaps because of moral uncertainty, perhaps because of just kind of deep philosophical uncertainty that can't be appropriately quantified in different ways. And I think that when one does this, it's possible to say, put a great deal of weight on a kind of worldview like this one, while compromising with a lot of other more commonsensical considerations and lead to a type of non-extremism. That would be my own kind of take. That's a nutshell response that could much more could be said about. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about intervention points and then wrap up. I think in an ideal world, the kind of discourse around existential risk and action would look very different than it does today. So I think in an ideal world, we'd be moving to a setting where existential risks were systematically analyzed, the intervention points were sought out, people were cooperating to address the risks that were really in ways that were consistent with what we owe to future generations. I think we'd ask ourselves questions like, if future people could vote on this, what would they ask us to do? And I think that would lead to a lot more serious discourse in climate change, nuclear weapons, bioweapons, artificial intelligence, and other issues. I think, you know, it's an interesting question. How do you bring about that world? And I think, and bringing about a world where people are thinking about things in that way, there'd be roles for people to explain these ideas, to popularize them, implement them in governments and industry, raise funds necessary to execute them, and to think about what kind of fundamental reform could take place in our institutions to better reflect these types of concerns. There's a nice essay by Tyler John and William McCaskill about this issue that I can provide a link to with the rest of this. However, in practice, you know, we're far from that world, and we need to think about how we can develop a kind of track record of making meaningful change in that direction. So I want to talk a little bit about intervention points on engineered pandemics, AI, and also existential risk factors that are kind of general purpose responses that aren't specific to any particular existential risk. So I think in engineered pandemics, we could start by strengthening the biological weapons conventions. they're really under budgeted, under enforced, and not thought about as seriously as they could be. There are also technological responses that I think could help with the situation. We could develop platform countermeasures. And by that, I mean general recipes for rapidly immunizing the population against novel pathogens or broad spectrum antivirals, the kind of thing that might be helpful against an unforeseen attack. This is kind of different from the normal method of, wait until something is affecting the population and only then respond to it. In responding to, we could also start thinking more about how we could prepare for a world with democratized access to bioengineering. If we had better DNA synthesis screening, it might be harder for people to get access to the kind of DNA that they could use to synthesize viruses for worrisome attacks. And finally, we could change some of the norms that relate to science experimentation. So, I mentioned earlier that there had been experiments that have been done that demonstrate the ability to increase the virulence, transmissibility, and vaccine resistance of different pathogens. Some of those experiments were done by scientists, and I think there's reasonable cases to be made in some cases that the work might be net harmful, and we don't particularly have the best institutions to think about that right at the moment. Some organizations that work in this space include DARPA, the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and pictured to the right, the Center for Health Security, which is one of Open Philanthropy's grantees. In AI, I think we're at an earlier stage, and there's still a lot of value in understanding the problem better. There are technical dimensions that correspond to each of the aspects of the alignment problem that I discussed, and different people have views of their own about how the problem could be solved. But so there's a role for people with an interest in machine learning or computer science to do technical research that will be needed to solve those problems and make it easier for us to benefit from very powerful AI systems. Finally, there's a range of policy problems, and we could benefit from improved advice for decision makers at organizations developing and regulating powerful AI systems. A couple of Open Philanthropy's grantees that I'll just highlight very briefly, where one can do this type of work, are the Center for Human Compatible AI, which is led by Stuart Russell, author of Human Compatible, which I mentioned earlier, and also author of Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, which is one of the main textbooks in the field. And Chai basically works on solving the AI alignment problem. And there's for people who are interested in machine learning and computer science, it's possible to train there and get into the field. The Center for Security and Emerging Technology is a think tank at Georgetown University. It's funded by the Open Philanthropy Project. They specialize in providing high quality advice to policymakers. I think providing this kind of advice over the long run will be one of the most promising ways to reduce potential risks from advanced AI. And the team at CSET is quite well positioned to provide that kind of advice. You can read more about them on their website to get a sense of what kind of work is possible to do. Finally, this kind of relates to my remark about not liking technological speculation. It's possible to focus on what we call existential risk factors. An existential risk factor is something that increases an existential risk, even if it doesn't constitute an existential catastrophe on its own. So I think a war between great powers would be an example of something that isn't automatically an existential catastrophe on its own, but it might amplify a lot of the risks that we've discussed in this talk. And I think there are very interesting questions that the effective altruist community is getting more into about how can we reduce the risk of a great power war? How can we improve the quality of institutional decision making in a general way as another area? So there's been some really nice work by Philip Tetlock on super forecasting, which is basically demonstrating that you can identify certain people who are particularly good at making forecasts about the near-term future that are calibrated, and there's particular ways you can kind of aggregate all of their forecasts to do better than many other methods that are available for making short-term forecasts. I think that's particularly exciting work. 80,000 Hours has a page on improving institutional decision making, which you can look at, has a wider range of ideas. So just to summarize some of the key points of the talk. technological X risks look larger than natural existential risks. Risks that haven't come online yet look larger than the existential risks from technology that already exist. Existential risks matter in a massive way for future people. It's hard to upper bound the number of future lives that might be affected by an existential catastrophe, and even small reductions matter a very great deal. We're living in a special time in the sense that we're probably going to have particularly high existential risk in this period of history compared to future periods, if there are any periods that have existential risk to a substantial degree at all. And it looks like our existing institutions will plausibly fail to effectively address these risks. They don't have the best track record, and they don't have the best incentives. AI and engineered pandemics are the main existential risks that are currently prioritized by the EA community. I've tried to give you a sense of how they could result in an existential catastrophe. Much of the fundamentals of this are still being worked out, but I think there are plausible methods of understanding these risks better and beginning to address them. So in closing, I'd like to emphasize that I think this is a set of very important, but currently quite poorly understood issues, and it's an exciting time for the field. And I hope that what I've said will encourage you to think carefully about existential risks and whether there's a way you could make a meaningful contribution to any of the issues I've described. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, Nick. Would you mind just stop sharing the presentation? So
yeah, sure.
Oops. So thank you for this talk. So before opening the floor for some questions from the audience that is here with us, I'd like to ask a few general questions that the people that are going to watch it later are going to get to know you a little bit better. Do you mind sharing how you've gotten involved in existential risk in the first place?
Yeah. Let's see. How did I originally get involved? It was a bit of a gradual process. I think maybe the first time I really encountered the idea was I read Nick Bostrom's Astronomical Waste on his website. I had kind of like stumbled onto a paper he wrote about infinite ethics. I was working on my PhD in ethics, and it was this nice paper. I was like, what else does this guy have? And I read Astronomical Waste, and then I had conversations with other people in the kind of early days of the effective altruism community, and kind of learned more about it. So it was kind of a gradual process. I was originally someone who was particularly interested in global health and had a kind of like nascent interest in animal welfare. But I sort of, after reflecting on some of the arguments here and elsewhere, I kind of decided this was like the main thing I wanted to work on.
It's very interesting. So some of the people who are going to watch this later, maybe in their very early stages of their university degree, their bachelor's, do you have any recommendations for what to do at these stages for people that want to get more involved and later become prominent in the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough to give general advice. I think it's important. I think I would say look for something at the intersection of is related to existential risk and is something you feel excited about and like you could be one of the best people at working on. It's like you feel like it would really get you excited. And I think I would just say spend some time thinking for yourself about which of these risks seem like the biggest deal and what really makes sense, because it's still kind of in the early days of this field, and I think a lot of things could change over time. So that would be some of my advice. And I think I hesitate to get more prescriptive than that.
What's a skill set that you think someone should try to develop in the early stages?
Sure. So, I mean, I think valuable skill sets include I think for technical people, like machine learning experience and, experience in bioengineering, biology could be very valuable. For people who have more of a policy bent, I think economics backgrounds can be quite good. I think a lot of philosophers have been pretty useful in this area. It's just kind of like a clear thinking style. Could just be a bias that like a lot of the founding people are like philosopher types, but I think it is actually useful. I think like entrepreneurial types can be really useful. People who are just kind of like reliable at getting things done and organizing people, I think can be really useful. I generally think people getting involved in policy somehow, it doesn't have to be policy that's terribly related to existential risk, just like getting experience doing important things for a government, I think is a kind of underrated thing for young people to do from my point of view.
Interesting. Do you think there is something that you could have done that would have placed you in a better position right now?
I think I'm in a pretty good position, and I think there's serendipity in that. But I don't know. It's a tough call. Like, I feel like I got a lot of value actually out of thinking about some of the philosophical issues. But I don't know. Maybe if I were entering the field today, I would probably be more likely to do economics or machine learning, given my own personality.
Interesting. And you're working on the problem at Open Phil, and I assume some of the people that are very interested to maybe do so as well in the future. Do you have some recommendations, or do you mind sharing how you've gotten to Open Phil, if people want to apply to Open Phil, what they should do, and just to describe how the work looked like?
Yeah, it was a very different situation, I guess. Like when I kind of got involved, it was sort of more like it was a much smaller number of people, and we were kind of like arguing on the internet, and got to know each other that way. And so I think it's not very generalizable, but a lot of it was just kind of like and there weren't organizations, so it's kind of like volunteering, and like I was hanging out with the people from what's now the Center for Effective Altruism. Back then it was kind of like giving what we can in 80,000 hours, and I was sort of like, there were a bunch of us as volunteers, and we were making things happen, and I ended up being on the board of that. And I think just like volunteering, I think like at the early stage, I think it's great to say yes to a lot of things, and just if it's in the area that you're interested in and you like the people, just saying yes to trying things, I think is a good way to build connections and start making things happen. In terms of getting a job today, maybe my recommendation would be something like get to know the effective altruism community, go to some of the events like EA Global, and read some of the stuff online, learn about it. Maybe write some blog posts or something if that's your jam. Like if you're somebody who likes to write and think about this issue, these types of issues, I think it's actually a pretty good way to get noticed. If you just like if you're writing stuff and people are like, oh, that was really smart. I think people often will notice it. And finally, you can apply. We are hiring for some roles right now, but even when we're not hiring at Open Phil, there's a kind of general application page, and people who are interested can just apply.
So thank you for the answer. I have lots more to ask, but I want to also involve other people from our audience, and I'm sure that they also have a lot of questions on the content itself of the lecture. So just by show of hands, if you don't mind, so I'll moderate, and let's start. Let's open the floor. Yeah, Gil, go ahead.
All right. Thanks so much for that talk. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask about the sort of AI scenarios, talking about stable authoritarianism, I think you called it. So would you say there's a significant difference in X-risk-wise between a leader or a leader caste using the AI, sort of like I think Bostrom calls it an oracle, or rather the scenario where the AI is the leader itself actually taking control? I mean, arguably, a disinterested AI would be better for humans as opposed to like an omnicidal maniac like gaining control or something like that. So does there seem to be like a significant difference there?
Yeah, so differences between Oracle AI versus sort of
in human hands,
like a sovereign kind of unleashed AI, and versus and also kind of just human versus AI. I think, I think the key point from my point of view is that, an authoritarian leader needs to, right now, they need to rely on cooperation from some people at the top of the empire to like administer the state effectively. If you have AGI or you have high level machine intelligence and you have machines who can do those jobs, then it really reduces the number of people you have to rely on. I think that's like the key point. So if you have a system that's just a question answering machine, but it's not like going out in the world and doing stuff, I think it's still kind of, I think it would make a meaningful difference in terms of how easy it would be to run a state while relying on fewer people, but it'd be less of a kind of total automation thing. So I think it'd be less powerful. And then I guess on this question of what's worse, I mean, I guess between the two, sort of AI running things and a human running things, that's bad. I mean, I guess a human's probably better because unless they're truly evil, they still have some sympathy for their fellow beings, and
yeah, that's reasonable.
I guess I would go for that view. And with the AI, there's like, they might just be totally disinterested. Like, it's not like they're going to do anything cruel to us per se, except insofar as it maybe helps them win in a conflict. But it's kind of more like a disinterest, and sort of like the analogy is more like, I don't know, the way humans treat animal species in nature. So it's not like we're like kind of cruelly making their lives terrible. We're just kind of like doing a bunch of development, and it like pushes them aside. It makes them irrelevant.
All right, thanks.
Let's take the next question.
I can also bring up, yeah, so you don't.
No, go ahead, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so a lot of it seems to really hinge upon some views regarding the growth and how we expect economic growth to continue in the future. So say, yeah, if it turns out to be extremely fast, then increases risks. If it is slower, then I guess it lowers the value perhaps of the future. So I'm curious about your opinions there.
And when you're talking about growth, you mean growth in AI or just growth in the economy in general?
In the economy in general.
Yeah. Okay. So they're very complex generally. I guess like the economy in general and existential risk. So I have a fear of coming across as like anti-science and anti-technology because I'm emphasizing, the role of science in bringing about our biggest existential risks. And I think that role can't really be disputed. But I do think, it's important to like emphasize the graph where kind of, a bunch of things were bad for a long time and then they all got really good at the end because of the scientific and industrial revolutions. And so what's the best, what else can we say about growth? I'm very sympathetic to people like Tyler Cowen, who kind of argue that growth has been a driver of a lot of the things that are best in life and lifting people out of poverty. And there's a lot to be happy about and to be grateful for. So I definitely hold those views. I think, in an ideal world, we would pursue growth, but we would kind of ensure we're ready for it when we're pursuing growth in areas that kind of seem especially likely to contain existential risks. And I think that would kind of be the compromise that we would go for. And that's a little vague, but it would be like the general spirit.
Okay, let's take the next question.
Yeah, so I was just bring up Matt again, but I accept that like speaking about biological weaponry, it seems that even if you do have like a system of balance of not even if you don't have like a single actor taking care of things, like making sure things end up all right, which seems to be like also what's psychologically comforting for us. Like we need there not to be like a system that sort of works out, like a laissez-faire, like insurance against mass extinction, but rather we want there somebody to be somebody. But yeah, so I do agree that systems like that tend to be more like delicate as opposed to like the crazy actor that comes out of nowhere and drops a vial of like disease in the middle of Times Square or something like that. So so would you say that it's definitely necessary to be like a sort of body that keeps in mind existential risks? Because I do tend to agree, but there might be claims to the contrary.
Yeah. With MAD, I do think MAD is like not bad, you know? I mean, I think it's kind of, in some sense, it's done reasonably well with nuclear war. I mean, I'd say there have been close calls, you know, like there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's other examples. There's a nice book, Command and Control by Eric Schlosser, that kind of goes through all of these in the history of nuclear weapons. And, you know, it's a little hard to know how close we've really gotten to a nuclear war. But I do feel like, you know, it's not a perfect protection from strategic miscalculation and mistakes, and it's not, and you know, we mentioned the rogue actors. So so with MAD, you know, I think there's still this room for kind of error that could make things go wrong. And then, you know, some of the other existential risks are fueled by kind of non-MAD factors. So you know, the AI case that I'm describing is sort of, it's kind of like, it's sort of like the fundamental root of it is more like there's a rush to push forward because of this tremendous economic incentive of being able to automate more and more things. And then, you know, it can be, and there's a sort of geopolitical version of that where a country doesn't want to be left behind. And, you know, they're going to make a trade-off between that and like their estimate of the safety level. So there's a sort of prisoner's dilemma-y thing to it. And no, I'm kind of inclined to agree that MAD type considerations make it a lot less bad than, you know, it might have been if absent MAD or something. But it seems like there's still a lot of room.
If I can interject there, like even in sort of the market-driven AI scenario, I guess you could argue that, you know, economic advantages tend to like top out at the point where there's too much automation, and there's the sort of like the market demand to that will peter off. But so there's still some sort of like scenario where this, again, not because of one single actor acting in any single way, but still sort of sorts itself out.
Yeah, I agree. It might sort itself out to some degree because of that. In some ways, I don't know, in the economic slow takeoff scenario, I'm kind of, in some ways, I'm more worried about the regulatory aspects of it and the externalities. So even if an individual firm can kind of have incentives to sort of nail it and solve the alignment problem well enough for their own purposes, you know, they might not have the incentives to solve it well enough for regulators' purposes, or like to internalize the externalities of it. And, you know, if we're all kind of like getting more dependent on something in a way that we can't walk back, it doesn't necessarily take care of itself. And I think climate change is sort of like the relevant example there. Like, so I don't think that climate change is on a path to make us go extinct. But you know, a lot of people do. And I think if we lived in a world where it definitely was, I'm not sure it would be a lot different than it is right now. So it's kind of disturbing.
Okay, let's take the next question.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so continuing that line of thought, you said that a lot of people thinking that climate change is a huge risk for existential risk, and I guess the same has been said for a nuclear risk before. So, like, what kind of can we really hope for some change in the future if people will believe more about in other types of existential risks, or maybe like the question I'm trying to get at here is, would public support of regulations or general activities to mitigate existential risks, is this something which seems plausible?
So I think this is, I actually need to get going after this question. So this will be, I think this will have to be my last one, but I do think it's plausible that these things could be addressed. I think in some ways we're at like early stages where, you know, in some ways you want to hand things to the government when you kind of know exactly what you want them to do, so that like when it goes through the sausage factory, what comes out is something you still wanted. And I think when something's, you know, when you need a scalpel because you need it to be the exact thing, it's like, it's not when you kind of want the government to go and do a bunch of it. I think there are things here that we do want the government to do a bunch of. So, you know, there's a lot of things that would have helped with COVID-19 that would help for an engineered pandemic as well. So more general purpose and faster diagnostics that are more widely distributed, you know, things where we're just kind of automatically detecting things at very early stages and responding, kind of test runs of developing vaccine candidates and antiviral candidates under pressure against a novel pathogen, just kind of having that capability ready, having people who are doing that all the time, I think is something that would have been smart. It's the kind of thing that we would do if we took pandemics seriously as a kind of thing that, like, you know, kills about as many people as wars. I think we would just do it anyway. We wouldn't have to worry about existential risks in order to justify it. So I think there are things that we could absolutely do, and I think on the AI side, the thing that governments could absolutely do right now is just fund computer science research that is related to the alignment problem. And there's some of that. The NSF funds some of it. And there are some DARPA programs that are relevant, and, you know, we could have more of that. And I think that would be a good thing. And then, you know, I think over time we would want to have, as things get clearer, we could have more specific asks, and we could have more people who are kind of like are building up expertise that's in the intersection of like the government and understanding these risks. And I think that would be beneficial and put us in a good position to handle these things better in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk, Nick. It was a pleasure having you here, and genuinely thank you. If you like the content, please subscribe to the channel, and I think we'll wrap up here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.